a choice, do I?
Do your microphone come in during the talk?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Right, so redirecting the details of an accidental maintainer. Now, before we start, there are projects for which I'm not an accidental maintainer. That's not what this talk is about. So what do I mean by an accidental maintainer? These are projects I never set out to become a maintainer of. Some of these I've never even looked at or touched the code before my first PR and then became a maintainer. So some examples are on the slide here: requests, PHP paralleling, and in both cases I was lucky there was a second person who also ended up being a maintainer. And for those people who are wondering like what the hell are these projects, requests is how WordPress gets updated. It's part of WordPress. So how does this happen? You may wonder. Most of the time it happens because I see my CI failing on something often to do with a new PHP version. So I submit a patch fixing their bug or their compatibility issue and hope that it gets merged, but hang on, they have continuous integration checks and I get a red cross. Continuous integration is failing. So I look and I'm like, okay, am I doing something wrong? Oh no, it's not my patch. Their continuous integration is failing because they're behind. Either they haven't updated their action runners, or they're still on Travis and Travis doesn't support open source anymore, or they need to upgrade to newer PHP unit version. So I then submit normally about 3, 4, 5 PRs to fix their CI. Then I have a passing green mark so they can clarify that my PR is actually good. And then the waiting starts. And depending on the project, the waiting continues. And more people start complaining about the issue because other people start noticing it as well. And leaving comments, can this please be merged? Can this please be merged? And the issue gets more and more likes. And yeah, if it still doesn't get merged, at some point you take over. Be aware, this PR being open and getting more and more comments like this should be merged, that's exactly how executors work and how the hack worked there. In case anyone's not heard of executors, it was basically a long-term attack on open source and on one of the structural pieces of open source, which was done by putting pressure on the maintainer to merge something and give someone else commit rights. So this can be a really dangerous pattern. In this case, you're lucky I'm not a malicious maintainer. So, the latest in this list is PHP CodeSniffer. And how many of you have not heard of PHP CodeSniffer? I see a few hands. Okay, in the PHP world, there's basically 2 tools which can help you maintain consistent code style and often do more code quality checks on top of that as well. There's CSFixer and PHP CodeSniffer, and PHP CodeSniffer is the biggest of them. So, yeah, I did that. Now, why did I take over CodeSniffer? It's quite simple. It was too big to fail. We're talking about a project with nearing 6 million downloads a month. We're talking about a project with 400,000 dependents. This is too big to fail. And if we look at the people who were involved with the project, there was basically nobody else who could do it. And I had other plans, seriously. This was not my intention. This is not what I wanted. I had other plans, I had other commitments, but it was too big to fail. Something had to happen. And when Greg, the original maintainer, said he was abandoning it, I didn't feel I had much of a choice. I had to take over. So how does this happen? How do projects get abandoned? Well, let's have a look at the lifetime of a project. A project starts all greenfields, and it might just be an experiment. You want to try a new technique, you want to play around with something, and a lot of projects start and end there. But then there are projects which mature and actually become popular and widely used. And this mature phase is good. This is where you want most projects to be. Then sometimes things happen and the project enters the zombie phase. It doesn't get releases as frequently, the PRs don't get merged as frequently, but there is still some traction, so things are still happening, but much slower than normal. And if things go well, it goes back to the mature state at some point as well. So project wavering between that second and the third phase is not a problem. What is a problem is when you get to the fourth phase. And yes, most projects, most open source projects go straight from the first to the fourth phase. And that's fine. Hopefully you've learned something along the way when working on the project and then abandoning it. That's absolutely fine. But when it's a popular project, when it's a widely used project, that fourth phase is what you want to avoid. So, how does this happen? Why do projects get abandoned? Well, there's only one answer. Life happens. And that can take all sorts of forms. That can be, someone starts a family, get kids, has different time priorities. Or they get a busier job or a different type of job where they don't have the time to spend on open source anymore. Or, they might need to take care of an elderly parent. All of these are perfectly valid reasons to make different life choices. Basically, life happens means, for most people, they get a life. I still have to find mine. Unfortunately, it also means sometimes that there are health reasons, whether it's mental health or physical health reasons, why someone has to stop. And this might sound abstract, and it might be that you're thinking that, that happens to other projects, or that's a faraway future, except it's not. One of the other projects I'm involved with, which is the composer installer for CodeSniffer, it started with 2 maintainers. They asked me to become a third, which is a healthy group of people for a very small project. And we're back to 2. Why? Because one of the 3 maintainers has got terminal brain tumor. This is not abstract. This is not something, which only happens to old people. This is someone in their 30s who is dying. This is real, and again, a perfectly valid reason to abandon the project. The problem with this, however, is on open source projects, most communication happens via GitHub, where you don't have a private DM system, thank God for that. But the problem with that, again, then is, how would you find out? It's not as if you open a ticket on GitHub saying, oh, by the way, I have a brain tumor, can someone take over? It's not the kind of thing you do. So a lot of those kind of projects would get silently abandoned without anyone even knowing about it. The only reason I know about this going on is because I have off GitHub contact with the other maintainer. And they know that third person in person. So this is a risk factor, and it's a risk factor which is in all your dependencies. And you might all think like, yeah, but this sounds very technical, and this is, I work with WordPress. Yeah, but WordPress has dependencies. It has the dependency on requests, on Sodium Compat, on PHP Mailer. It has dependencies. And not just runtime dependencies, it also has dependencies in their CI, in their continuous integration. PHP Unit, PHP CodeSniffer, WordPress coding standards, the setup PHP action runner. There's a whole range of dependencies on which WordPress is built. So this applies to everyone. Everyone using open source software, whether you are aware of it or not, you have a supply chain risk there. And this supply chain is something you need to be aware of. So yes, life happens. And one of the things I want to call out specifically is maintainer burnout. This is a real thing. There's often, especially with a bigger project, a lot of pressure on maintainers. And quite often it's a maintainer at some point then saying, yeah, hang on, I'm struggling balancing my life and my work and the open source project, and I need help. Can someone help me with funding so I can downskill other paid work and spend more time on the open source project. And companies then hear help. And they think that, oh, we can help. So they put someone on the project. Someone who's never contributed before, who's a newbie to the project, who starts submitting low quality PRs. And this maintainer, who's already overworked and unpaid, then has to start coaching and training their employees to get those PRs in a mergeable state. So the maintainer generally just tries to ignore those PRs and not merge them and focus on what's really important. And then the community pressure starts building up, like, yeah, but these PRs are being left to rot. And at some point it goes like this, and the maintainer again goes like, help! And again, companies put people on it instead of supporting the maintainer by giving them funding. This is the road to maintainer burnout, to maintainer meltdown, I'd say. Please do not be that company. So, now you've heard that the project is being abandoned. Now what? Sometimes, if it's a dependency for which there are multiple options, you can just switch it out for something else. Sometimes that means that, yeah, your replacement is not feature complete compared to the one you were using, so you might still need to start contributing to the project. Sometimes there is just no good replacement, or the replacement would need that much work that it's not worth switching to it, or switching to it would be such an investment for your company that it could even bankrupt you. So it might actually be more economically feasible to hire someone to start maintaining it. So how does that happen? What happens when someone takes over a project? What are the options? Well, first of all, adding a new admin to a project, or switching out the old admin for a new one. This can happen, but not always. A lot of projects originally get maintained and get built in someone's personal account. In a personal account, you can't add a second admin. Or the project gets maintained in a company account, and the company does not allow a non-employee to be an admin in one of their projects. So adding new admin sounds like an easy option. It is often the best option if possible, but not always possible. So the next best thing is transfer the repo, preferably to a dedicated organization. I'll come back to that. Again, you need the cooperation of the active original maintainer. But if that maintainer is no longer reachable, is no longer responding, you're out of luck. So then we get to the third option, and that's fork the repo. And by the way, then straight away defork it. Because otherwise the PRs are still going to the original repo and not to your repo. Not very practical if you're taking over. So fork the repo. The downside of that is, aside from the commit history, you lose everything. You lose the open issues, you lose open PRs, you lose the wiki, you lose GitHub pages, so you lose literally everything else, and you're going to have to rebuild that or start from scratch. It also means people, when you transfer the repo, people get redirected by GitHub to the new repo. Except that doesn't happen when you fork the repo. How do people know to go to the new repo and what the new repo is? So it will take time for people to find your fork. In the case of CodeSniffer, this is the scenario which happened, but with one twist, it's a blessed fork. The original maintainer has basically said, this is the new repo and I fully support Julia taking over. I've been lucky in that way. I've also been lucky that I've been able to keep the package's name, the composer package name. That's not always the case. So this makes things difficult. And the last option is let it die. Now you might think, yeah, but then someone else will fork it. Yes, that will happen. Probably about 50 people. And nobody knows which of the 50 forks to contribute to, and in a year later it's still dead. So letting it die might be a slow process, but it still dies. So, congratulations. If you've taken over, you're now a maintainer. And what does it mean to be a maintainer? Whoops, that was the slide you should see. Okay. Basically, nothing ever just works. If something just works, it's because someone in the background is putting a shitload of work into it to make it so. Nothing works, just works. There's something always happens, whether it's a new PHP version coming out, a new PHP unit version coming out, Travis abandoning open source, Composer changing how it handles plugins. There's always something to keep things running. Nothing ever just works. Maintaining is a lot of work. So what does maintaining primarily mean? Keeping things running. And that means a lot of the not fun stuff. It means the chores, the working through technical debt, enabling other contributors, unblocking them by making sure everything keeps running. What it also means is envisioning the future. And that means looking ahead, not just to the next major release, but also to the one after that, and maybe even the one after that. Planning for the future and putting dominoes in place. Because if you want something to happen 2 majors from now, sometimes you need to make sure there's a deprecation mechanism in place which the next version can use to deprecate something else, so there's room for the next feature. So you need to plan ahead. You need to look at the long term. And sometimes that also means you do that in private, because it's easy to overpromise. And users will say, yeah, but you said that was going to happen. Yes, it is going to happen, except I can't do everything at the same time. So you sometimes also piecemeal the information of what is coming for the next steps to your users. You don't announce everything, but you do plan for it. And you do keep that long-term plan in mind. What it doesn't mean is working on bug fixes and new features most of the time. Of course you sometimes will, but if you want to grow a community, you need to make space for other people to shine. And to do that, you need to give them something to work on. And preferably something also at entry level. So new people to the repo can get started with something which will actually help them and can be satisfying for them to work on, which can be merged. So taking on all the bug fixes and new features yourself doesn't leave room for others, it basically means you will be maintaining this on your own forever, which is not a good place for a project to be, because that's a buzz factor of 1. I'll come back to that. So, if we want to prevent project from being abandoned, we need to create a healthy community around the project. Now, what does that look like? I think a lot of people here will recognize the images which I'm going to put on screen now. A healthy project has a team of maintainers, the first cycle around that with regular contributors, and then the next cycle around that with drive-by occasional contributors. And in a healthy project, a maintainer can say, okay, something is happening in my life, I'm going to step back for a little and become a regular contributor for a little while, and maybe at a later point it'll become a maintainer again. Or a drive-by contributor might have some more time at some point between jobs and contribute more and become a regular contributor for a while. So people can switch between those 3 circles really. With an unhealthy project, you have a single maintainer and you have very few occasional contributors. This is the highest risk you can have. To come back to what the buzz factor means, is the buzz factor the term something people here know, or should I explain it? Yes. There's few people who know it by the dance. So the buzz factor basically means how many people do need to be in a bus which crashes for the project to be dead. If there's a buzz factor of 1, only one person would need to, be in that bus for the project to die. A bus factor of 1 is the highest risk. And unfortunately, a lot of projects have that. So, what we need is for projects to start doing succession management and to be conscious about that. So how do you do that? First of all, you start documenting things. You document the policies of the project. This is how we treat certain things. This is how we want to deal with new features. You document the release process. You document what you expect of contributors. You create a contributing guide, which is expansive. I mean, when I first started, it took over, it was this. Now it's this long. And one of the things I did in that contributor guide to activate the community is also point people to the labels I created, like Good First Issue, like Needs Investigation, like Waiting for Opinions. Those are issues, even when you're not familiar with the project, you can still pitch in and you can still help the project by giving an opinion, by being aware of what's going on there. Another thing I did there, and I'm not saying follow my example by definition, but it's one thing which worked for me, is I created a community CC list. There's a lot of external standards which are built on top of CodeSniffer. So there's external projects like plugins for WordPress which are built on top of WordPress, external standards built on top of CodeSniffer. And any breaking change I make impacts them because they have to change their sniffs, their code to accommodate the project. So if I want to make a breaking change, I used to, at random, just add some people in a CC list. And I wanted to take the random out of it. So I basically asked the community, who wants to be on this CC list? Who wants to be informed and help me make those decisions about breaking changes and whether a proposal on how to support a new PHP syntax in CodeSniffer, how to do that. Those proposals have an impact on maintainers of external standards, on integrators. So getting their opinion is valuable for me. And it also gets them involved again in the project, which gives the project a wider base for existing and for the future. Next, identify candidates for promotion. Identify people who might at some point, could grow into a maintainer role. Ask them if they're interested in coaching and start working with them. I have currently 2 people who I'm coaching like that, who are growing and who, on the one hand, are also sparring partners for me. I sometimes have things which I don't publish yet, but which I do discuss with them, like, this is what I'm looking at, what do you think? It's good to have people to spar with, and it's good for them to learn from the way I'm thinking, to grow into a maintainer role at some point. Validate your trust in people. Because I already mentioned executors. CodeSniffer rewrites the code of other code bases. It's so bloody easy if I wanted to introduce vulnerability. So I can't just give anyone commit rights. So I really need to validate my trust in people there. Validate that they also can oversee the consequences of changes which are being made. And then, of course, if all of that has happened, promote people and give them the trust you want to give them. And lastly, funding, and I'll come back to that. Even if your project currently thinks it doesn't need funding, it does. Even if you don't need funding, the next maintainer might need it. Or you might want to buy some pro packages of GitHub itself or external tooling which you use in your project. Your project needs funding no matter what, even if it's to build up reserve for the next maintainer. So, independently of whether you already have a successor or not, independently of whether you're still a sole maintainer or you have a group of maintainers, you need to make sure the keys to the castle are shared. And what are keys to the castle? Access to the repo, access to the GitHub organization, access to Packagist, access to domains, to DNS, to Open Collective, social media accounts, etc. Now, GitHub has this amazing feature in which you can basically, for your personal account, set a successor. I'd recommend anyone who's on GitHub to use that feature, but please ask them permission of the person you assign as your successor. That's kind of important to do. If you are with a dedicated GitHub organization, it's easy to add a second owner, which is really helpful in these kind of situations. And for anyone wondering, yes, I've done this for CodeSniffer. I have someone who's not actively involved with the project, but who I've worked with for a long time, who I really trust, who has the ownership of the organization as well, just in case something happens to me. So, this has been a journey over the past year, because this Sunday it's a year ago since I took over CodeSniffer. So, I've learned some things, and I'm going to share those and hope that you'll learn from those as well, and take your own lessons from that as well. First of all, and I'm just going to let you read this for a second. Can someone explain this to me like I'm a 5-year-old?
We want you to do everything, but we're not going to pay you.
Yeah.
Repeat that.
Open source is not free. Open source is never free. If you think it's free, it just means you are not paying the price. The maintainer is. Whether it's in mental health, in time, in money, someone else is paying the price. But it's not free. The free in open source was never about money. It was about freedoms. Do not ever forget that. And if you do forget it, that's called exploitative capitalism. So, funding is not optional. We need to start normalizing funding open source. Think of it this way, in 10-15 years' time, a lot of maintainers of open source projects who are currently still active will reach pension age. So independently of everything else which could happen in the meantime, they will at some point want to step back. If we don't normalize funding open source, we are going to have a huge problem in 10-15 years' time. So we need to start that conversation now. And I'm not looking at you as individuals to fund open source. What I'm looking at is ambassadors. Ambassadors who will start this conversation in the companies you work in. Start a conversation about maybe joining the Open Source Pledge. Open Source Pledge is a way to fund open source and distribute the money across the projects you use. You can also use projects like ThanksDev or GitHub sponsors who can look at your tech stack and find the projects which are open to funding. Do not forget to do this. Do talk with your manager. Do talk with the board of directors of your company. Tell them they have a mitigated risk, a mitigated business risk, if they just expect open source to always be maintained for free. Because it can literally bankrupt companies if they need to switch from one stack to another. So, yeah, funding open source helps prevent that risk. And we have a maintainer paradox here, which I often forget to highlight in this talk, and I'm going to mention it here now anyway. The maintainer paradox is, if it works, people forget they are using it and don't think of the fact that it needs funding. If it doesn't work, and often that means like 1% of it is not working, it's only a tiny thing not working, but it doesn't work, people don't want to fund it. You can't win. But think of it more like insurance and start that conversation about funding open source. Please, I beg you. Right, enough about funding. Let's look at some other do's. Okay, we talked about funding. Next, set up a dedicated organization. Why is that important? Well, one of the reasons is, I already mentioned, I can't really easily give a second person commit rights to CodeSniffer because of all the risks involved. But I can set up separate projects, sub-projects, and I can give other people commit rights to those projects. So the main project is not at risk, but there are other sub-projects which other people can maintain, and it also opens up the organization to be less dependent on me, because there's other people maintaining parts of the larger project. So a dedicated organization helps with things like that. Other things, which I already mentioned as well, expand the contributing guide. The community CC list was one thing, but another thing I mentioned in there, for instance, is I banned any AI-generated code. Why? Because I don't know what code is trained on. If that code is trained on GPL code, I can't accept it in my repo, because it violates the license. And I can't change the license, because I need permission of everyone who's ever contributed. So, things like that. Make sure you set expectation. And if you have a good contributing guide, it also helps you to manage the repo more easily. One of the things I said is, for new features, open an issue first to discuss and get guidance. If people then come up with a half SPR with a new feature, even though it's highly in demand, if it doesn't fit with how the project should move forward, I can close that pointing to the contributing guide. I've told you not to do it this way. This is not the way. One of the things, for instance, people want is a baseline in PHP-CS. And people who've used PHP-CS and use PHP-Stan will understand why people want the baseline. Yeah, I've had a PR really quickly for that. I've had to close it. Because that baseline does not work with something which contains a fixer, which will automatically fix code and completely invalidate the baseline every time it runs. So, yeah, and let's just think about that and think that through properly. I can't accept the PR because the amount of support requests I would get would inundate me and halt all other development. So have a contributing guide which you can use to guide contributors, but also to shut them down when it doesn't fit the project. Work with PRs and protected branches. There may be people watching your repo. They don't get notified when you commit straight to the main branch. They do get notified when you open the PR. So I also work via PRs. And I work with protected branches. I make sure, especially when my PRs do not get reviewed by other people, that there's as much quality control being done via continuous integration to make sure that my PRs pass that minimum quality check I can do. It's the way to keep myself honest. I don't get a free pass. So yes, expand CI, expand the QA you do on your project as much as possible. Also to document what the project's expectations are, what the project is supposed to do. It will make it easier for people to step in and become a co-maintainer because they know then what the intention was of the code. And like I already mentioned, signaling via labels, and the last one, close quickly. There's a lot of issues being opened often which are just noise. If it's noise, close it. There's enough valid issues which need attention, so don't get distracted by the things which are invalid issues. And don't feel guilty about closing things either. So, first lesson I learned, say no. A lot. And it's not something I enjoy doing, but you have to do it to protect yourself. Another one, have off GitHub contacts for your own sanity. Have some people you can spar with, have some people you can, there's some things you can't always share on GitHub and you do want to share them with someone, which is about the project. So have off GitHub contacts, have video calls with people, have a Mastodon contact or a private DM somewhere. Next one, stick to your plan. No matter how slow the plan is progressing, the plan should have room for new things in it, but you do need to keep to that long-term vision of where you want to go. Otherwise, it's too easy to get distracted by the day-to-day and never actually get anything done, and your plan will just flounder and just be efficient, which never gets anywhere. And lastly, pace yourself. There's only so many hours in a day. You can't do everything, and you definitely can't do it all at once. Protect yourself, take your own time, and take time for yourself as well. So pace yourself. Between when Greg told me he was abandoning and the announcement that I was taking over, I took a month. I took a month to set up the new repo, to prepare funding channels, to get everything in place for the repo to be open to start receiving issues and PRs from other people. And only then we announced. That's a form of pacing yourself. So, obviously not everything is, roses and everything. So there's also things I really struggle with, and for every maintainer what they struggle with will be different. For me, one of the things I really struggle with is slow turnaround and feedback. I even mentioned this in the contributing guide. Basically, if I see a PR come in, I respond, and then the next day someone fixes up the PR, I can merge it. Because the context of that PR is still in my mind from when I reviewed it. If I see a PR, I respond to that within a few days, and someone then doesn't respond for 2 months, that means I'm 300 PRs further down the line. I don't remember what this PR was about. I need to completely regain the context of that PR, and every time I need to do that, so every time the response time is again 2 months after that, it takes me exponentially more time, which makes me exponentially less willing to do so. So, another thing I struggle with is when is good enough? I can't set the same standard of quality for contributors as I set for myself. At the same time, this is a repo with plenty of technical debt. And I don't really want to introduce more technical debt, which I then have to fix up. So when is good enough? Can I ask certain things of contributors, or, well, can I ask the same of them as I ask of myself? No, but where do I strike the balance between that? It's lonely. At the end, the buck stops with me. I'm responsible. Whether there's always people who are not going to like what I say, what I do, what decisions I take. No matter what you do, it's lonely, and you are in the end responsible. And the last thing I struggle with is I don't know everything. Like if it's your own code base, when you started from scratch, even if you've not looked at it for 2 years, you go back to the code base, it's like putting on an old coat. It may smell a bit funny, a bit musty after a few years. It may have some tears and it may be a bit old. But everything about that coat is familiar. It's not the same with the code base you didn't start. There are parts of the code base I've never looked at, never touched, because I never needed to. So I don't know everything. There's a lot I do know, but there's also a lot I don't. And as there's large parts of the code base which don't have tests, and for which commit messages were kind of minimal, it's not something I can easily fix either. So we're finding my way there. So, for those wondering, CodeSniffer, did it survive? Does anyone know the answer?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
It survived. Where are we now? Okay, so CodeSniffer is still alive. If we look at these two graphs, the first one is last year in the old repo, this is this year in the new repo. Now you might think like the old repo was more active, but please look at the scales. Yeah? So this is sort of like catching up from the old repo, from everything that wasn't merged there. And you can see a steady line of issues and PRs coming in and being merged. So now if we look at the packages numbers, and packages is not complete because We also have installs via FAR files, via FIVE, via clones, etc., etc. But it gives an idea. These numbers are comparable because I managed to keep the package's name. So you can see the numbers are still steadily going up. And if you then compare the numbers at the bottom, that's the old repo versus the new repo. This started from 0. All things considering, 12, 13-year-old repo on GitHub versus a brand new repo, I don't think I'm doing badly. I remember when I applied to Open Collective that they said, oh, we don't accept any project with less than 100,000. I had 0, and I was like, yeah, it's not going to be a problem. And they were like, it's not a problem anymore. Right, so what have we done in the meantime in this year? 11 new releases, and keep in mind, when I took over in the 1st of December last year, the last release before that was in February. So since then we've now had 11 new releases, the first one a week after I took over. We've got runtime support for PHP 8.2, 8.3 and 8.4, all of that done. Syntax support complete for 8.2 and 8.3. Do not get me started on PHP 8.4. The property hooks is the bane of my existence. Have patience. I've unfortunately not found a way to clone myself yet. This is going to take years. And I'm not joking. Sorry? Well, cloning myself will also take years, but yeah. While adding support for PHP 8.4 is really going to take a long time. We've done a lot of focus on improving performance and reducing technical debt. Seriously, for a code base which was, 17, 18 years old, it had something like 65% test coverage, and none of the framework essentially was covered by tests. We've gained 10% code coverage in a year's time. That's huge. That really is huge. And if you look here, what do we see here as new features, new wins? A lot of this is focused on the end user. What I've done here is I see support requests coming in, and support requests take time away from me developing. So how can I reduce support requests? By making things a better end user experience. So having a performance report so people know when things are slow if reported to the right repo instead of complaining to me. Giving sniff maintainers the ability to deprecate sniffs without straight away having that as a breaking change and breaking builds. Having a refound help screen so people can find the information they need a lot more easily. Improving the documentation for sniff. All of these things are meant to make end users more self-reliant, reduce support requests, freeing me up to actually do the work to bring CodeSniffer forward. So, how can you help? Well, first of all, know your dependencies, and I hope, even though a lot of this was about CodeSniffer, CodeSniffer was just an example. The problem here is projects being abandoned, your dependencies being abandoned. So know your dependencies. Know what their status of active maintenance is. If possible, contribute to those projects. Start keeping an eye on them, being involved with those projects. And please, please, please start funding them. So, any questions? Oh, sorry, this is, I noticed just before the talk that I forgot, that my desktop didn't sync correctly with my laptop. I have fixed this slide. The slide thing is still correct, the feedback thing is not. So this slide has not synced correctly. So the slide will be up on Speaker Deck. Any questions?
Not all that.
Have I knocked you all silent?
So how much is the project now? Are you the only maintainer with just a few people in the circle?
Yes.
So you need more maintainers?
I need more quality contributors who could grow into a maintainer role. Definitely. I also need more funding. It's a combination of both. this is very specialized field, so it's not easy to, well, it's easy to write a sniff, it's not as easy to write a good sniff. So it's easy to start encrypting, and there's definitely good first issues people can easily get their feet wet with, including the documentation issues, because it will give you a chance to sniff at the code base without actually touching the code, but still learning about how things work. But yeah, I'm trying to create a roadmap for contributors by having good first issues, help wanted issues, need research issues, to give people entry points at different levels of their own, for different skill levels basically. And yes, I'm still the only maintainer.
How do you strike the balance between closing issues early and still maintaining a friendly atmosphere and like encouraging new contributors? Because I think I've experienced like having issues being closed very quickly can come across really unfriendly and not encouraging to try harder. It's more like I'm not really interested in contributions.
I hear you. So the question is, when you close quickly, how do you do that in a friendly way, basically? It takes effort. It definitely takes a lot of effort. Sometimes it's an issue where there is an easy answer and I just answer it. And then give the person 1 or 2 days to respond, and if they say that solves my issue, I can close it. Sometimes it's a duplicate and they just haven't searched, and I'll add the link to where the canonical issue is and close it because of that. I do try to give people pointers either where they can find an answer. I do try to stay friendly when I'm doing it. It's not like I close it without a comment. I've seen that done in repos as well. Not something I'm a fan of, because I know what you're saying. It feels very unwelcoming to people if that happens. So I try not to make sure that the way I close tickets quickly is still making people feel seen and valued. I'm not sure if I'm always succeeding, but I definitely try. Does that help? Okay.
Okay. So you will be available for more questions.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I'll be around still.
Yes.
Do people want to find me in the community corner? Does that help if there are more questions? Okay, then in 10 minutes time I'll be in the community corner. And then you can come and chat with me there. Woo!